Okay, so good afternoon, everyone from the Philippines, and a good day to our audience members from all over the Philippines and all around the world. So in the chat, we're seeing people from many ASEAN countries like Thailand, Bangladesh, but also from countries like Ireland and Canada. Welcome, everyone. I am Faith Kaube,
And I'm Mike C.
and we'll be your hosts for this webinar entitled A Justice of Participation in Challenging Times, a webinar on occupational justice and the Participatory Occupational Justice Framework. This webinar is brought to you by the Occupational Science Interest Special Group of the Philippine Academy of Occupational Therapists and the Department of Occupational Therapy of the College of Allied Medical Professions, University of the Philippines, Manila. Welcome again, everyone. So some house rules before we proceed. During the presentation, please keep your cameras and your mics off. During the open forum after the presentation, for those who are able, please switch on your cameras so we're able to see each other when we're talking to each other, and keep your mics off unless you're speaking. You may raise your hand using the reaction icon in the Zoom dashboard. So if you're on your computer and you look at your dashboard below, you'll see reactions. You'll have a raised hand reaction there, and we'll call you. Or you may turn on your microphone and just introduce yourself and speak, or you may type your questions or comments in the chat box, and the hosts will read them out for you. All right. So now I think we can now proceed. Our speaker, Professor Gail Whiteford, is currently in the position of Strategic Professor, Conjoint Chair of Allied Health and Community Wellbeing, a newly established position between the Mid-North Coast Local Health District of New South Wales Health and Charles Sturt University. Professor Whiteford has held several senior positions over time at universities in Australia and New Zealand, and was Australia's first Pro-Vice Chancellor of Social Inclusion at Macquarie University. In her home discipline of occupational therapy, she has been a thought leader, scholar, and researcher for over 2 decades, and enjoys an international profile. Professor Whiteford is currently project leader of a World Federation of Occupational Therapists project, convening a team of researchers from around the world in research and initiatives aimed at exploring the links between occupational participation and well-being. She has been the recipient of a Canadian award for her outstanding contribution to the profession internationally, and in 2017, received one of Australia's highest awards in occupational therapy, the Freda Jacobs Award. She is an inaugural fellow of the Occupational Therapy Australia Research Academy and is currently chair of the OTA Research Foundation. It is my honor to introduce Professor Gail Whiteford. Professor Gail?
Thank you, Faith, for that very warm and very lovely introduction. So I'd like to start by saying how delighted I am to be here this afternoon, and thank you so much for the invitation from yourself and Mike to be able to talk about pretty well my favorite topic at the moment, the POJF, and perhaps have an opportunity for discussion about some very big issues in this area with people who've joined us from a whole range of places. I'm really excited to see the list of destinations that people have joined us from this afternoon. So I'm delighted to be here. So Mike, without further ado, let's have a look at what we're going to be doing in this lecture this afternoon. And I do want to stress that this presentation is going to be the basis for what I hope is a more extended discussion. I'm really keen to hear from all of you about how you're interacting with the concepts presented, particularly in knowing that people are in different contexts, the context that you're in. So I want to start with a bit of a review of what the 4 pillars of occupational therapy are. I know that we're here interested in occupational science, but what I'm going to do also is really speak to the relationship between the two, but this is a bit of a review. Then I want to look at occupational justice. I don't know how familiar people are with occupational justice. I think some of you are very familiar with it. Some of the work in occupational justice might be a little newer to some of you. So I also want to look at occupational justice and some of the newer work I've been trying to focus on. And there is a new publication, Mike, I can send the link through it for it later, on how we understand occupational justice in a comparison to other forms of justice. It just helps people get a little bit clearer to be able to describe what it is that we're talking about in occupational science and occupational therapy. I want to look at the POJF. Again, it's been a framework that I've been working on for a really long time. So I'm going to talk about the origins of that and how it's developed and the aspects of POJF that I think will have relevance and salience for you in different places, and how people have used it and where it's gone to. Again, I get pretty excited when I know that at this stage, I think it's been downloaded by people in 72 countries. So it tells me that there's interest there. I want to look at then going on from that, the concepts that surround structural inequality. And there's a reason why I want to talk to you today about structural inequality and how the POJF can relate to us addressing structural inequality, and how structural inequality has really had, structural inequality has an impact on occupational participation. And we've been in a historic contextual era where that's been especially the case because of COVID. I really will delve into that a little bit more. I then want to look at the articles that underpin a critical occupational therapy, which in turn underpins the POJF. And then finally, it's a newer work again that I developed for the Sylvia Docker lecture in Australia to look at what I'm calling occupational justice plus, and this notion of what radical solidarity is. Sounds like a bit of an interesting term, but how that might be a basis for working with people who experience structural inequality and who experience challenges to forms of occupational participation in society. So we've got a bit to cover. So hold on and let's work through it, and then we'll throw it open for questions, as I said. Okay, Mike. Okay, this, as I said, will be a review for people, but I wanted to start here to remind us about the what, how, where, and why of occupational therapy. And I think this is particularly useful in working with students or people who are new to understanding what occupational therapy is about. So the what, of course, for us, what is core knowledge, as you well know, is occupation. And there we're interested in people participating in those occupations that are necessary, the everyday necessity of many occupations. Obligatory, so what society obligates us to engage in, and voluntary occupations. Now, I really want to stress here that, and this is about the relationship between the two, in occupational therapy, because our interest is in enabling occupation and occupational participation, we draw upon the research, the corpus of research and knowledge about occupation as a specialty domain of concern. And that's been generated and built upon over time through occupational science very largely. So it's really important to remember that the foundational building block in terms of knowledge and our science, occupational science and occupational therapy. We are informed by other sciences for sure, but occupational science is based to us. And this is about everyday life. You all know that. You work with people. You know that our concerns are what people want and need and are obliged to do in their everyday life, in their life worlds. And as many of you know, so many people facing a lot of challenges to do that for many reasons. How do we engage? I would always say to people, if you see someone doing something to someone, it's not occupational therapy, right? It's always about a collaborative approach. It's always enabling. And I think sustainability has become such a important notion in there as well, that the way in which we engage with people, the how of occupational therapy, has got to be something that it's got to be done in a way that's sustainable in terms of what's going to happen for the individual, the family, the group of people that you're working with in the longer term. And that's that knowledge of enablement is the occupational therapy knowledge base. And the outcome that we're hoping for there is empowerment in the longer term in a sustainable way. So the where is about context. And I think over time for me, I've gotten more and more interest in context and the fact that we really can't tease occupations of people and communities out of context, because occupations are really so contextually bound, and everything down to the form of occupations is about context, meaning in particular. You all know we're today working across many different cultural contexts, and how occupation is understood, perceived, experienced, meaning that underpins it is going to be so different in those different contexts. So as I said, I'm really always been interested in this, the layers of contextual influence on occupation. So here we're really looking at how we understand occupation as always being socially, culturally constructed and politically and economically situated. So in any setting where occupational participation is an issue. And if you think about, again, we represent many different national groups, how gendered, for example, occupational participation can be, how this plays out in terms of faith-based and secular communities. Context is so important. And for us in occupational therapy, this is about, if we get this right, if we really focus on context and understand what's happening here, and that's the situated nature of the occupations that people want and need to engage in, we're going to be relevant to people. We'll be highlighting our potential relevance to the lives of people if we look back to everyday life, but also our value. My thought is that if we don't address context appropriately, our relevance and value is really diminished. And over the years, I've seen occupational therapists kind of get it really wrong in lots of places, because they're not addressing context and they're not addressing people's cultural identity. So kind of missing the point. Okay, and then of course the really big thing at the end is the why. Why are we here? What are we doing? What is our mandate, both for ourselves? How do we mandate ourselves professionally, and also in the discipline occupational science and occupational therapy? How do we mandate ourselves? But what's our social mandate? And I have to say, we're very fortunate in many regards, is that we do have a societal mandate for our work. We have to constantly reinforce it, and we have to remind people what that is, but we do have a mandate. And that's about making society a better place at the end of the day, isn't it? We want to be in the engine room of social change. We want to reduce injustices and advance occupational justice. And that's for people who don't have the ability, the tools, are not empowered to do that. So I'm thinking about vulnerable and excluded and marginalized groups. And we'll talk particularly about people who are often in institutions, who are marginalized for reasons of being in institutional care, how difficult that is. And this is all about social inclusion. So the ends of occupational intervention here is about ensuring that all people have the rights of inclusion. Okay. Thanks, Mike. I didn't even have to ask. How's the sound going? Can people hear me okay? Mike, is that
Yes,
sound lovely?
yes, very, very clear.
Lovely, good. I'll continue on then. Okay, occupational justice. We talk about occupational justice more and more, which makes me very happy, I've got to say. And I just want to pick up some core ideas that came from the very early discussions about occupational justice. So it might be that, as Anne Wilcock and Liz Townsend said early on, that occupational justice was about equitable opportunities and resources to make sure that people can engage and participate. In the early days of the POJF, some of the background development, Liz and I spoke about it being a vision for society in which all people, all populations have opportunities, resources, privilege, and rights to participate in both their desired occupations, but occupations that express their potentiality. And you, I'm sure, have all had a lot of experiences where that doesn't happen for lots of reasons. It is in some ways a utopian notion, and some of you might be interested in Anne Wilcock's earlier work. Anne was my PhD supervisor, and the way she spoke to a utopian vision, that occupational justice was a utopian vision for society, which means we might never actually achieve it, but we should always be striving to get there. Claire Hocking, another colleague of mine that we've worked together over a long time, talked about occupational justice as being a big idea and really focusing on bridging the gap between people's well-being and those very harmful social conditions that really do delimit what they can do and importantly what they can be. And as you know, engaging in occupations over a lifetime and participating is so linked to people's sense of self and their identity. So she's picked up some of those ideas in her definition there. Okay. Right. So this is the bit that is got a bit more work in it. And this is reflected in the chapter that I'll send through the link to Mike. It's a new handbook on social justice that has been published by a professor of social work. So it's great for us to be in there. Okay, what's the differences here? I know that you've all heard the term social justice, and then forms of social justice being around procedural, distributive, and restorative justice. They're all terms you may have come across, but certainly social justice is the term that people are most familiar with. So I'm not going to go through every one of those cells there, but certainly in social justice, the focus is on equality. That if we think about what is contested terrain in society, that social justice is focused on people having an equal voice, that the focus is on the fact that there's been unequal human and fiscal resources, so that we want to equalize them. And going down, the aim is to have equal voice and representation and procedural rights in society, and that procedural processes are equal for people. It gets kind of complex, but that's a bit of an overview. On the far right column, let's look at what's different in terms of our foci in occupational justice. So our main concern is participatory. So occupational justice is about that justice of participation. That's what we're interested in. And the focus is about that meaningful engagement in all those different types of occupations. We're interested in classification of, we are more interested in the social rather than the straight economic value of occupations, because we know they're meaningful in many different ways, and that people compete. There are competing needs for opportunities and resources in society. I'm not saying that the economic value of occupation is not important. It is, it's really important, but we're seeing it in through a broader lens. Now, here's where it begins to get really important, and the differences are important between the different types of justice. We want to enable different opportunities and resources for citizens and individuals and families and social groups. So we're saying that people have different needs depending on the context that they live in and engage in a range of occupations, or not, or restricted or deprived from. And we need to recognize the different needs and therefore the different opportunities. So when we think about issues of power, the next cell down, different opportunities and resources, what we're pursuing is important so we can enable full citizen participation. An example of that would be, I think in many places, for example, there's governments give a grant for equipment, and it's the same for all people. So if you, in Australia, for example, if you need a wheelchair, you're going to get an amount of money for a standard wheelchair. But as we all know, people are going to be in different contexts. So if you lived in, those of you who've been to Australia, a really difficult, rough part of the country, you're going to need different type of wheelchair because your needs are different. And maybe a teenager versus an older person, your needs are going to be different. So we stand up for those different needs and therefore the different opportunities that people have access to or not. And we address them, those differences. We go back to social justice. It's about equity and everyone getting the same. We're saying, no, actually, people have different needs. Therefore, we need to pursue different opportunities for them. We need to support them in ways that acknowledges their uniqueness and their difference. And finally there, the actions for justice is about, we're both recognizing people and their unique identities and needs. And our actions are focused on the enablement of that difference as a basis for social inclusion. So all people in society have the right to participate fully in society, whatever background they come from. We'll talk a bit more about that later, but there's a fair bit to unpack in this table. As I said, if you have a look at the full chapter that it's in, it unpacks that a lot more, but that's an overview for today and an important summary. Okay, let's keep going. Where did all this come from? How did we really come together to create the POGF? It's such a backstory now, and it's been over time. Of course, with Liz Townsend, who I just acknowledge as such a thought leader and visionary in her own right. And it was first published in the very first Occupational Therapy Without Borders, which again, those who know the books are so groundbreaking at the time. We had at the time really discussed our discontent with many of the theoretical models and frameworks that are around, and felt that they were not context sensitive, and that the focus on clinical outcomes wasn't particularly relevant, particularly for us working in communities. And not all models, as you know, and frameworks are really that focused on occupation. I think there's been a lot of development there, but certainly we were very motivated to do something that was focused on three key concepts: occupation, enablement, and justice, and to do something pretty different in that space. Okay, Mike, I'm just going to have a sip of water. So it is different. What makes it different? It's not linear. Many models that you see will really predicate a process of starting here, doing this, doing assessment, intervening, evaluating. You know, when you work with people, and particularly at a community level, as you know, I'm sure many of you know this, that it's not really that cut and dried, and the process does not have that clear linear trajectory. Life and people and the life world in which occupations occur means that our interactions really are not always that linear, and probably nor should they be. We didn't want to have a framework that was oriented to problems or pathology and didn't have a clinical orientation, because this is such a departure from medical model and the influence of biomedicine. From an occupational perspective, the way that we would see what's challenging for people and what are barriers to people are not about what's within them. It's actually what's external to people that is problematic. There's no assessment because we're not dealing with pathology. We're not trying to measure change, so we don't use assessments in the PHF. It's process driven. What does that mean? It means that we're interested in how we're working with people as we go along, their understandings, and them having control of that. And in that way, having a different kind of input, which is a facilitatory input, a coaching input, rather than being the therapist who's in charge here and is going to tell us what's happening. We're here to coach, support, advocate for, but following that process, we're not in charge. The people that you're working with really have the power over what's going to ultimately happen. And, you know, I've seen over time, surprisingly, some occupational therapists really struggle with fully handing over power and control. It's interesting. There's ways in which we're still inculcated into that relationship. So it means ultimately then that the person, the family, the community that you're working with, the locus of control over these processes resides with those people. So they're in charge of how things are going to happen and where they're going to go to. And again, that's a bit of a different way of being with and working with. Okay. So I've said it's nonlinear. These are all circles that represent aspects of the process of the PHF. You might enter into the field with people, with a family at any one of these points. People might have already been working in some way to address the situation they find themselves in. But one of the key processes is at some point to frame the concern as a issue of occupational injustice. So again, it's not about the fact that people might have an intellectual disability. It's about the policy environment or the structural environment that prevents them from participating in society. So, for example, a group of occupational therapists in Chile were working with parents who had intellectual disabilities and had been supported to be parents, bringing up their kids, doing a great job. And then there was a change in policy overnight by government without warning that basically disallowed people with those disabilities to look after their children independently. The children were removed, which was a huge trauma for that community. And I'm so proud to say that the occupational therapists that I have spoken to who were part of that raised that as an occupational injustice. There's nothing wrong with these people, this group of parents inherently. The injustice were they're unable to continue to participate as parents with their children. And so they tackled that as an injustice, but framing it as an injustice was really important in how then actions unfolded after that. So it wasn't about how disabled this person is or is not. It's the negative impact of that change in policy that completely deprived and denied a group of people from participating in probably the most important occupation in their lives, which is being parents. So I hope you can get a sense there that at some point, the sharing the understandings, developing the understandings about the occupational injustice that could be a family, could be an individual, could be a group, community are experiencing is really important. Working with partners, absolutely. Developing a plan. Of course, you need a plan because you need to know where you're going. Look, finding resources. I spent a lot of my time scouting for resources, networking, finding resources both from government and non-government agencies and different sources, because sometimes, not all the time, but a lot of the time, we need resources to help support whatever is the change that's going about. Maybe it's helping to create a new facility. I've been involved in setting up a sensory garden in the community that needed some money behind us to get the building and to have the plants, etc., etc. So you need resources. You do want to evaluate how things are going, but importantly, it's not necessarily you doing the evaluation, it's that you're supporting the group of people that you're working with to evaluate in a way that's culturally appropriate for them to get a sense of where you're up to. And then coming back to that sustainability word, how will this be sustainable going forward? How will that group of people take more action for that to become true, for that sensory garden for children with disabilities in a town to continue? How are they going to get it maintained? How will they bring people to it? What will be the ongoing actions for this group of parents in Chile who've had their children taken away from them? So what's going to happen in the future? And at that point, you may no longer be involved. Or you may, or there might be an involvement in a different way. But I'd have to say, I think that the real success of enabling occupation is that you are not needed anymore, right? Do yourself out of a job and a role. Okay, so those are the processes in a nutshell. Next slide, Mike. Okay. We spoke about context before, and it is really, really important. And you know what, I think in the last couple of years, we've realized just how, even at an international level, what's happening there can very much influence what's happening in our own lives. So let's start in the POJF and the collaborative processes that we are focusing on and what we're doing. But then immediately around that, there's really basic local environmental system structures that, of course, we have to attend to. So there's just physical space to start with. What's the access that we have or don't have to resources, technology, safety and security are considerations. Like many of you have probably been in places that were not particularly safe. So we need to address that, particularly when in working with people, we have a duty of care in our working with them as well. So local systems, very important. Next level out is the national context. So as you know, every country has got its own political, legislative, policy, economic, sociocultural stuff happening in it. There's actually a lot to history as well in many places. And I think really importantly here, we would want to be looking at what human rights observances are in place and perhaps where are the erosions of human rights when it comes to participation. I would have to say that even in Australia, there are, particularly in institutions, there are, I would call soft erosions of human rights, but we want to look at that when it comes to opportunities to participate occupationally in society. how is the cultural and what are the gender-based legislative frames? So, for example, in Australia, if you were a woman and you were married, you weren't allowed to be in the workforce till I think in the 70s. So, for example, that's different in every place. We need to understand this stuff. What are the religious and secular considerations? And again, what are the sustainable resources and our access to them? Next zone out, we're going to look at what are the, just going back, I'll just do that final ring, Mike, thanks. Regional and global context. As you know, in the era of pandemics, borders became harder and there was a closure of borders. So, but all of that has affected all of us, and alliances between different countries and trade partners, health challenges, that's affected all of us. So we really are one world these days, and no one's in isolation. And that, I think it's been so dramatic in terms of the impact on everyday lives and people in their forms of occupational participation. I think right now, as I understand, there's people, so there's a community in Shanghai who are still under very strict lockdown. So yeah, this stuff does and has affected all of us. Now you see there, I've got zone of structural inequality, and that's happening at most significantly at national and then throughout to regional and global context. So I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Okay, Mike. Structural inequality really became a focus during the COVID pandemics and subsequent lockdowns in different countries, because that's when kind of all of a sudden we saw structural inequality really playing out in front of our eyes, because all of a sudden it was very evident that some people were doing a whole lot worse during lockdowns than others. Suddenly a whole subsections of society were, the mortality rates from COVID were much higher. So it became very clear to us that there was some real inequalities in society. So what we're talking about when we talk about structural inequality is that it's about those aspects of society that are that affect our normal operations, and that the pillars of society, which are the social institutions, you know, like healthcare, like education, access to resources, health, IT, all that actually is where structural inequality gets stratified and solidified, and where people find it harder to move through their lives and participate occupationally. Jeremy Fishkin spoke about, used the metaphor of a bottleneck, and I think it's kind of a good one to try and capture this notion of how people progress through their lives and improve their lives, but how difficult that is if you're coming from a background of structural inequality, like for poverty, for example. How hard is it in many places to get an education? We're very fortunate in Australia. We have free primary and secondary education and subsidized tertiary education, but in many countries in the world I've been to, you have to pay, so you can't participate in education. That's a classic artifact of structural inequality. In many countries I've been in, women are not allowed to, are excluded from participation in education after primary school. That's structural inequality. So people traveling through their life, and as they want to progress, they hit this bottleneck, and then progression any further is very, very, very difficult, if not impossible. So we can assist people, communities, to pass through that bottleneck. knowing that that's very hard and very challenging, through, for example, the provision of work skills programs. If we think about people with a learning disability, we might assist people to move from unemployment and poverty to employment and greater economic participation through having the skills they need for the labour market. So, and occupational therapists definitely do this. So that's what's called a meliorist approach. We're ameliorating the effects of the structural inequality on individuals and groups of people. Or let's think a little more radically, we might work to dismantle that bottleneck itself. Think about that. We might get rid of the whole darn bottle. and the way in which we do that are very different sorts of actions. So here, for example, there's been a real national advocating for legislation that requires government and increasingly non-government organisations to have meet a ratio of employment of persons with disability, so that the targets now in Australia is that for large organisations, the percentage is between 20 to 25%, which reflects the percentage of people with disability in society. How cool would that be? How you can see how powerful that is then in dismantling layers of structural inequality. Or, you know, we can actually do both. But increasingly, I can see the value, many of the things I've been in, that rising above the level of working at an individual to work at a structural level, bringing the knowledge and skills and the occupation focus that we do, can bring about structural reform. So, different way of looking at things. Okay. Picking up then these notions of human rights, power relations and inclusion, these are the articles that have underpinned the POGF since its inception. And I don't want to go through all of them, but of course it's about looking at human rights and what the institutional discourses are and environments that might erode those human rights. Disturbingly, some years back, two colleagues and I did some research on occupational therapists who felt that human rights were important, but it wasn't part of occupational therapy practice. Well, you know, it is. And certainly in research in occupational science, looking at the erosions of human rights and conditions. Power relations, as I've talked about, it's always about power sharing and working collaboratively, really wanting to ensure that all people are included socially, social and cultural relevance, meaningful occupation there, optimizing levels of choice, control and determination. This is really, really, really key, because in so many of the countries we're all in and many others, people who are made marginal for reasons of gender, race, religion, etc., have had levels of control, self-determination eroded, and choice with it. And we know there's a very powerful relationship between well-being and occupational choice. And finally, hope. Hope's really under discussed, and yet very important that people have hope and that you don't take people's hope away. People need hope, and they need hope for things to be different, and advancing occupational justice. Okay, and I just want to pick up this is where we've spelt that article out, just because it's so important, and I really want us to end on a pretty high note there. So occupational therapists striving to work with others in the pursuit of occupational justice, irrespective of attendant political and economic challenges and current environmental limitations. So hope and a vision of possibility underpins their efforts. And I just want to say that you should all be very proud of our World Federation, who were called upon very early on in the Ukraine conflict from WHO to be involved in helping with the people who were fleeing from the Ukraine, from the Ukraine, and that effort of supporting people who overnight became refugees. So again, hope's important there and a vision of possibility. But right now, I would still say my thoughts and feelings are with those people. So we've gone through quite a bit and we've talked about being with and working with people, but what's the foundation for us understanding people, their unique identities? We've spoken about people having unique identities, their aspirations. What do people aspire to? What do they want to do in the future? The knowledges that they bring. How do we do this in order to do and be with them in a powerful and respectful way? Next slide. Okay, so this is what I'm calling Occupational Justice Plus, and it looks like a small diagram, but it's taken me many years of thinking and synthesis to get to this. So I want to bring together ways of and opportunities for, very importantly, doing, which is occupational justice, with ways of knowing, respecting the different knowledges that people bring, and that's epistemic justice, with ways of being represented and understood, and people having ownership and control over that, which is what we'd call hermeneutic justice. Together, these represent occupational justice plus, because what really struck me over time is that to just focus on occupational justice itself was not enough. But if we bring together a focus on ways of and opportunities for doing, the ways of knowing, and ways of being represented and understood together with people that we work with, we might do something really important. Okay. So I'm going to start wrapping up and give us a chance to have a discussion. Global pandemics, as they've now been, have brought into sharp focus the structural inequalities that many people, most of them vulnerable due to disability, poverty, racism, all forms of discrimination, face. It's been a mirror and it's been held up to us, and we can't now not acknowledge that. So in this regard, we're now in this different era. That's the way I see it, in which structural reform and the advancement of occupational justice could be a really clear focus, resulting in this greater equity of participation, and alongside that, increased levels of social inclusion and well-being. It could also be an era of greater epistemic and hermeneutic justice, in which all people could have their identities and knowledges affirmed and represented. Or could be business as usual. Which are you going to choose? Okay, let's stop there. Throw it open.
All right. Thank you, Professor Gail.
Yes. Thank you, Gail, for that. I don't know, I'm still absorbing all the insights, and I've been reflecting throughout. And thank you again very much, Professor Gail, for that enlightening presentation. We are now opening the floor for any questions or comments, reflections from the participants. For those who are able, please turn on your cameras and your microphones if you'd like to speak. Please raise your hand if you'd like to be acknowledged, and so we'll call your name. Or you can also type in your questions and comments so I can read them for Gail.
That'd be great.
Okay. Anyone? Or I can start my comment. I have a comment from the chat box. I'll just read it to you, Gail. I said, wow, Gail, thanks for that reassurance that from the mediate agreement on the plan, enabling process, which is the third circle from the figure, you mentioned that the OTs are not necessarily or shouldn't necessarily be there present anymore, because it's about how the people who want to carry on the plan, the work, the project, or the advocacy, it's really about them carrying it through. It's just us really facilitating the raising of the consciousness, collaborating, looking for resources for them, and then they would carry. Did I understand that right? Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. Again, it's up to, if you invert that locus of control, and the people that you're working with could be a family, have the locus of control, then it's in a different role. And so they might want you to be there at other parts of the process, or not. You might come and go. That's the thing. But the point is that you're not really dictating the terms of how it's going to happen, or in controlling the traffic. And that's really important, because I think when I think about, particularly, for example, in Indigenous communities here, people would come in and say, well, this is going to happen, and you're going to do this, and you're going to do that, and then leave, and then nothing would happen. So nothing changed. You didn't develop capacity. So this is a process. I probably should have stressed that you're there to build the capacity of people to focus on the change that they want with respect to an occupational injustice that they're experiencing. So as I understood it from the occupational therapists in Chile, they worked really hard with those parents, but they were up front, and they were doing it in a way that they had control over how they're being represented. And they didn't want to be represented as, poor people with a disability or intellectual disability. Look what's happened to us. They wanted to be represented as capable, competent people to whom this terrible policy had happened, that changed their lives, that enabled, that meant their children were taken away from them. So that last column too of hermeneutic justice is also very, very important, that people have ownership of how they're represented. It's not us directing and it's not us making that call.
Thank you, Gail, for I was just reassured after hearing that from you. Anyone would like to ask, if you're still thinking of any questions or comments for Gail? I have one, Faith. Can I proceed with my question? I'll just ask it away. Many OTs, at least in the Philippines, have been trained to focus on the enabling dimension of occupation through occupational therapy, since our curriculum hasn't really underscored the competencies towards what you're saying about contextual and social change aspects of occupations. Well, at least when I was trained, I was just focused, my mind is really be an OT and enable occupations. In other words, OTs here, or at least based on my own experience, have always been actuating ameliorative practices rather than carrying out their practices towards a more social transformation approach. In my personal opinion, maybe the former is paid while the latter is not paid as an OT. So why else do you think this is so? And why do you think, what do you think we should do better?
Okay, I'm not sure I understand what you mean by paid versus unpaid. You mean in terms of where people are working, what they're focusing on?
Yeah, I think because when you enable occupation and you're working with individuals, you get paid by the hour, you get paid with that. But when you do advocacy work, when you do scouting for resources, mediating agreement with communities, you don't, at least in our system, we get like volunteer honoraria or honorarium, but we don't really get paid. So that, I think there's this professional conflict. Yeah, so that's just my thought. I don't know if that's.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, but I would, that division almost sounds like in one arena, you're focusing on occupational participation and human rights and a justice of inclusion. In the other, you're not. I would say you should be focusing on that wherever you are, and you bring that to awareness. You do what you can, whatever context you're in. So some of the best work I've seen in recent times, because I've challenged myself to go and be with people in different settings, and was with the team I worked with in a large forensic hospital here in Australia. And at institution, they're all occupational therapists, not out there in the community. But there is a lot of things about that system that really erode from the top down, the policies, the environment, and even the way the occupational therapists were practicing themselves, that delimited participation, did not develop the capacity of those people, and eroded their human rights. Now, they went through a process of seeing that they were part of the problem, not part of the solution. And that was very painful for them. And they changed their practice very dramatically to make that about occupational justice and enabling occupation, developing capacity so people could move through that system back into the community. But I don't think it's an actual division. I think the division is in the minds of occupational therapists. And I'm just going to throw the word out there, hegemonic practice. Some of you will know about hegemonic practice. Josie's got her hand up there. And hegemonic practice is about how we reproduce systems of advantage. We reproduce unequal power relationships because we're reproducing the power, for example, biomedicine, through acting in a way consistent with that paradigm rather than a true paradigm of addressing occupational and justice and advancing occupational justice. So the problems in here in the minds of occupational therapists, how that is doing to some extent. Yes, it is more difficult in some settings structurally. I get that, but if it can be done in one of the hardest environments there is, which is a pure forensic hospital, and man, those are tough environments. You can do it anywhere.
Thank you, Gail. I think Josephine wants to ask something. Hi, Josephine.
Hi, the thing I thought I would ask somewhat comment response to both your question and Gail is that I've been finding lately the POJF to be kind of a useful framework in looking at practice environments almost as a critical reflexive practice. As a clinician, in reference to what Gail's saying, I'm biased for practicing in the West, and we're seeing a lot more of our infrastructure transition into bundle-based models and more collaborative work environment payment structures, which I think is a great opportunity to utilize the POJF on an organizational level and understand the occupational injustices that are like reproducing through a hegemonic model. And that looking at the occupational rights, well-being, justice of the providers of services more ecologically. And I guess I wanted to maybe get Gail's insight on utilizing the POJF as a mode of building kind of that self-reflection on an organizational level, and then like to enter as maybe a medium of getting towards then the client-facing work to sort of like use it on ourselves and then have that then be something that could translate more towards the field. I find with that too, that might neutralize some of those budgetary concerns because that's built into the POJF.
Yes. As always, Josie, very good question. I reckon that what you're saying is exactly what I've tried to show in the latest article in the Brazilian Journal of Occupational Therapy, which is about how occupational therapists went through exactly that process. So again, Mike, I can send you the link to that article. It's one of the best step-by-step descriptions of the process of how this group of occupational therapists, they did start off with the PJO for sure, through deep practice-based inquiry process that I facilitated with them, were able to look at what they were doing and see how they really were not creating an environment of change, and they were actually reproducing the same system that made it more difficult for these forensic patients to progress through the system and get out and go to the hospital. And they kind of hated that. At one point, they just were upset and angry, but it gave them, the POJF gave them a tool for understanding how they had become part of the machinery that kept structural inequality going. I'll never forget one day, one of the therapists said, I just realized I haven't been working with patients in this hospital to help them prepare for their tribunals that enable them to be released into community. And so that's the most important occupation in their life at that time. But because I've been part of the system and because I never questioned it, I haven't done that. And yet that would be one of the most powerful actions I could have, is to be working with them on that. So yeah, I would really recommend that reading to you, Josie, as a blow-by-blow description of the process that you can go through. And it is possible to really deeply reflect on the purpose of what you're doing, the outcomes, and how it can be different. And they I would say, turned their practice around 180 degrees.
You mind if I add a short comment that I feel like in the US, we're sort of learning the costs of not doing this work, and withholding on that reflective process on occupational well-being, justice, and quality of life is a significant factor into the employment shortage that we're currently facing, and having conversations about what sort of supports are needed to really have sustainable well-being within organizations. And I just feel like there's a misnomer that there's somehow any service or advocacy work doesn't have economic value to it or translate over time, especially in terms of facilitating occupational therapy referrals in a traditional mindset. There's huge costs long-term economically from stalling and dragging feet on creating inclusive social systems. I just want to really affirm and put that out there, that I think that it's actually costing Occupational Therapy International to be a late part of doing this work on the ground in the field. So thank you for letting me interject that. But thank you, and thank you for your work.
Thank you, Josie. I would just add to that then, I think the most important development in recent times is that we should be showing that the ways in which we work people are collaborative philosophically, would be to talk about what we're doing as co-design. So co-design, co-creation, co-research. I think that we should be really embracing those paradigms and showing funders, showing institutions that what we're doing is working with people who are the consumers of these services in co-design processes. And funders can't argue against co-design. They can't, because we know now there's a wealth of evidence drawn on globally that co-designed programs are more cost effective because they work for people, because they're designed by people who are the recipients of them. So co-creation, co-design, co-researcher, those are all things that we should be focusing on, and then working with people as those processes and platforms for change. And talk about it.
Some comments and questions from the chat box. So first from Penny Ching, she says, I'm thinking about the skills. Do you think that a competency necessary to engage in this field requires knowledge in community organizing and development principles?
Not necessarily. It would, of course, it doesn't hurt. And I think there's been a lot of interest recently about the intersection between community development and occupational therapy that is occupation focused. Sure. But the principles of community development are all about self-determination and sustainability as well, and that respectful way of working with. And if it's not what the community ultimately wants, done in a way that's culturally and contextually appropriate, then you shouldn't be doing it anyway. So I don't think you have to have that as a separate qualification. I think that knowledge can really work, but I do think that we have the foundational knowledge and skill set and philosophical orientation to work in that space. And there are some good, really good examples. I think that Mike Sy himself has done some fantastic work in the field with women with addictions and been that lovely co-designed, co-produced space. So, you know, we have great examples of people doing that.
Yeah, right. Thank you. And another one is from Azharul Islam. Hello, Professor Whiteford. Thank you for your presentation. It really gave me new insights and learn about occupational justice. I have a question. How can an occupational therapist address occupational justice for refugees or people who are forcibly displaced, where there is no right to do meaningful occupations and doing any income generating activities are prohibited?
What a fabulous question. Thanks so much. I think that this is probably being played out right now as we speak in Poland. So the occupational therapists who have gone in there, as I understand it, we're going to wait for full descriptions, have brought an occupational perspective to that situation where they're highlighting the importance of doing and having meaningful doing, even in the refugee camp situation, or, you know, in the institutions where people who've fled have something to do, and particularly children. So there's a lot of focus on provision of play equipment, play activities, and then ways for people to come together to, for example, cook their own meals rather than just having meals provided. I think that initially the focus, and because it's a crisis situation, is the provision of shelter, food, a place to sleep. But now what's important, and we should all be part of representing this particular view, is that also people are going to need something that can help address their situation, but giving them some choice and control through engaging in really important and meaningful occupations in that particular context. I mean, people can be packing kit bags, they can be pulling together balls of socks. There's lots that people can be doing, but really importantly, I know from the research I did years ago, children are a really important focus, because in that post-traumatic space for the children, they can quickly lose the desire and the ability to engage in play. But if you think about that as an opportunity to provide those play activities in which children can find a vehicle to express that trauma, that's really, really important. So that is such a good question. Income generating activities are also really important for not just people who've been through refugee processes, but people made marginal through forms of structural inequality and poverty, where we can help set up programs where, so maybe people are packing satchels or crocheting woolen socks for somewhere else, that also becomes an income generating process or program as well, because that does two things very quickly. It gives people money. People need an income. It's powerful to people. I've seen that over and over, but it changes your status from being someone who's in need of assistance and support to being someone who has agency and skills to actually then make a contribution to others. And in a recent process we've been through in Australia, I'll talk a bit about that if I have a chance, we did a national call for narratives. And what we found that in the crises that people had during COVID, bushfires, floods here, people's narratives highlighted that doing with and doing for, really importantly, doing for others, gave them a sense of well-being and connectedness in the most extreme crisis times. So very good question.
I think my reflections relate similarly to that. So I'm doing my master's in medical anthropology right now, and my thesis is with families who live in high-rise residences, so very small spaces. And the interesting thing is that my data collection crossed over into COVID, the pandemic era. So I was able to talk to them before the pandemic and during, and you really see this, I think, where we OTs can come in, wherein children in the Philippines, I'm not sure how it is in Australia, our children haven't been allowed to go out for nearly 2 years. It was a strict policy by the government. They're not allowed outside of the house, not even in front of the streets. Sometimes if they live in private subdivisions or residences, they might be allowed, but otherwise they're not allowed anywhere, and there's already very little open spaces. So children are really cooped up inside their houses, lack of play. And when I talk to my research participants during the pandemic, the really stark change in their disposition and their mental health was very evident to me, where the lack of being able to meet their friends, their classmates physically, even though they're doing Zoom meetings, is very difficult. And so in the interest of protecting their health from the pandemic, we have enacted policies that are actually detrimental to their other parts of their health, their occupational health and their mental health.
Sure.
So it's very,
Because that's that unidimensional biomedical take on what health is, but we know that true well-being is much broader than that. And that's why our voice is so important, and our perspective is so important to be represented in there.
yes, and I think it's our voices who will champion the occupational health of these groups, not just of children, but also of other people whose occupational health and well-being have been impacted by COVID policies and other policies similar to this. It's very important because currently in the Philippines, it's really very biomedical right now. All of the policymakers right there are, they're doctors. I mean, not a lot of emphasis on occupational health and well-being. So the POJF is really, the discussion has opened a lot of my perspective with regards to how to approach or how to consider it as an OT, because I can see it as a medical anthropologist, which is where I'm having issues, managing both.
Sure. But also I'm going back now to the body of knowledge generated in occupational science. There is now a huge corpus of evidence about the central relationship between engagement in meaningful occupation and well-being. We know that going right back to the well elderly study that they did at the University of Southern California. There's now a mountain of evidence about that. And actually, I think that I've worked with medicos now who really get that, and some good psychiatrists now that they get that. And with the team in the forensic hospital, they were in the faces of these people. And now it's part of what they're requiring. So you can change that. You can change that, but point to that mountain of evidence coming out of occupational science and other places.
Right. We have a comment from a student. Oh, we have a student in the audience from Riza Arias. Hello, Professor Whiteford. My name is Riza, an occupational therapy student in Davao City, Philippines. She would like to thank you for giving such an amazing presentation. Based on her experience, she hasn't learned much about occupational justice because it wasn't mentioned or expounded on during her first year, and now she's beginning to understand its significance in her practice.
Fantastic. I'm really pleased to hear that, Riza, and take it forward with you. Good on you. And I just see we've had Thomas has posted a resource for playing crisis. Thanks for that, Thomas. Really important.
Right. We have any other comments? Anyone else would like? Josephine is raising her hand.
Just in comments to what you expressed, Faith, and kind of one of my takeaways from this presentation is just kind of wondering about the opportunity to host this perspective even within biomedical institutions with the lens on the employees that are working within them and how the COVID-19 process has strained industrial well-being. I know I'm biased to the United States, but I take some inspiration from the founding OTs in the arts and crafts movement that brought about the occupational crisis that industrialization was having on the physical, mental, and, it like contextual well-being. I'm seeing such a great opportunity in the United States to have an occupational, like a contextual occupational conversation, even within traditional biomedical models, because our staffing crises have strained our capacity and making healthcare institutions healthy and viable for employees and our clients. I guess that's sort of a Trojan horse moment to have some of these conversations take place, even within very traditional biomedical dollars and cents. Right now, it makes dollars and cents to be able to sustainably have biomedical employees live, work, play, have occupational balance. And I firmly believe that if we can cultivate that amongst ourselves as members of the professional class or whatever, bourgeois, that well-being and occupational well-being, if we can model it, we'll want to offer and generously give that and create a model that can actually feed down to our clients. So I just wanted to put that out there as maybe a lens that I'm seeing in the US.
Yeah, Josie, that's such a good comment. What's one of the things that's really taken off in Australia is staff choirs in hospitals. So where choirs, staff started joining these choirs and got them going, and even if they have to run from a shift and go and join the choir, and even if it's hard, in those hospitals where they have the staff choirs, staff report greater levels of well-being and engagement and are more likely to stay. So it's a no-brainer. You're quite right.
Thank you so much, Josephine, for that reflection and comment. I have one more question for Gail. You mentioned a lot about the characteristics of the POJF, that it's nonlinear, it doesn't need any assessments, no statutory instruments needed for the evaluation. Again, it enables co-designing. There is the concept of social occupational therapy. That's a concept coming from South America, particularly from Brazil. And the social occupational therapy model also has these characteristics. Can you tell us about how POJF complements this model? Are they the same? Do they have the same goals, aims? Can you just provide us with some insights on that, Gail?
Sure. Thanks, Mike. I would never say that I'm an expert on what the Brazilians call social occupational therapy. Some of the discussions I've had with people like Anna Alfitano, who's been really lead there, is that to me, all occupational therapy should be social in orientation. I've never seen a division. I understand in their system that's a bit of an expression of that. And I worry then that there's two types of occupational therapy when I don't think there should be. I think there should be occupational therapy that's focused on occupation. So, and yet I think that the way that, from what I understand, is social occupational, the way that's done in communities is very much in these collaborative, empowering ways, and that the wellspring of knowledge and understanding about how to go about this is drawn from the community. And I think that's a really central, we would share consideration, that the locus of control does reside with the community members. Occupational therapist there is more as that kind of facilitator in the social context and in social structures. So I see them as being completely complementary in their aims. Yeah.
Thank you, Gail.
Right.
All right, Faith, do we still have any comments or questions as we end our open forum?
There are no more questions or reflections. If, for example, people have a burning question after our webinar, perhaps they can email Professor Gail. Oh, wait, somebody raised their hand.
There's, Serenia. Hello, Serenia.
Hi, Mike, and hi, Professor Gail. What a great insightful presentation. My name is Surinya Sipacharawood from Chiang Mai University. Occupational justice is quite new for us in Thailand, as social justice is concerned with creating inclusive society. But as I said, it's quite new for us. And we have been teaching Bachelor of Science students in terms of occupational justice and injustice. Would you please tell us how to develop and provide a curriculum to facilitate students' understanding and identification of occupational justice from your experience?
Sure. Well, okay, that's a good question. I think that if we go back a couple of steps, I think that the way that occupational therapy curriculum are structured often make that a little hard. And what worries me, and I've seen some other comments here, is that then occupational justice becomes a bit of an add-on somewhere. And I don't think of it as being very important, which is kind of sad, because to me, if we're not about the ends of social inclusion through advancing occupational justice, why are we here? And that's, going back, Surinya, first, those 4 pillars of occupational therapy practice, give them that to start.
Yes.
I say to students, print that up and put it on your bedroom wall or wherever you're studying and refer to that.
That's a good idea.
Because that's the what, how, where, and why of it all. But I think that we need to, occupational justice has to be addressed in 3 ways. One is formally in the curriculum. So you need to have in which that is actually about occupational justice and forms of injustice, of which, of course, occupational deprivation, I'm always interested in occupational deprivation, is there. So it needs to be what they call chunked in the curriculum. It needs to have a formal and named place. Then you need to also integrate it into other subject areas. So it's woven through. So it's chunked and woven through. So that, for example, when you might be having a subject which is about occupational therapy and aged care. Wow, there's a whole lot of occupational justice when we start talking about aged care addressed. Absolutely. Let's think about the institutions that people live in with aged care. Let's think about the way they're excluded. When we're talking about disability, occupational therapy working with people with disabilities, we should be talking about occupational justice. So we have it in chunks, we have it woven through. But I think that I've been occupational therapy educator for so many years, we show it through our actions. So get a group of students, I've been to Chiang Mai, volunteering with, for example, the head injury unit there, or organizing a picnic for kids with developmental delays, or, so there's many ways in the activities that you're involved in as the school, and you have a really good school there. I know some of the people can be show what our concern is by demonstrating what you're doing every day, and with people in the community, by having events, having things going on, set up choir for children with disabilities, or, create a performing group. I think a beautiful, Chiang Mai traditional cultural music of older people, weaving. You could have a weaving workshop for people with visual impairments. I mean, you show your concern and join with people in the community. And really important role as staff members to do that.
Yes, thank you so much for your suggestion. It made me provide me very insightful, and I'm going to talk more with my staff, and I think they have already been doing something, but we do not use the word occupational justice or injustice quite often in our curriculum. So probably we should get started to use this word, and also what you say is a way of opportunity for doing and knowing, and being represented and understood might be very important for us to get started. Thank you so
Yeah,
much.
so that last chart as well, occupational justice. Let's bring those three together so that, for example, you know, people with disabilities or people who had, you know, been involved in suffered injuries, whatever, you know, find their ways to them to have a voice and represent themselves. That's so important.
Thank you.
Okay, khap khun ka.
Khap khun ka.
Okay.
Thank you, Serinia. Now that's all we have for our discussion. Thank you everyone for taking part in our webinar with Gail Whiteford. We are coming to an end, and before we end, we would like to present a certificate of appreciation to Professor Gail. Okay. The Philippine Academy of Occupational Therapists and its Occupational Science Special Interest Group, in partnership with the University of the Philippines CAMP Department of Occupational Therapy, present this certificate of appreciation to Professor Gail Whiteford for her invaluable contribution as resource speaker for the webinar entitled A Justice of Participation in Challenging Times via Zoom on April 24th, 2022, signed by Charles T. Bermejo, Chair of the Committee on Standards and Ethics of the PAOT, Maria Lucia L. Laniagas, Core Leader of the OSSIG, and Peña Francia E. Ching, Chair of the Department of Occupational Therapy at UP Camp. A round of applause reactions for Professor Gail Whiteford. Thank you so much, Gail.
Thank you so much. That's lovely. I really appreciate that. And I'm very happy to hear, like you said, I think before, Faith, I'm happy if people have follow-up questions that they can just send them through directly. As I said, I'm always happy to keep having these discussions because this is how change happens organically, right? And you are all the future.
Yes, thank you very much again, Gail. And I don't know if we have a photo opportunity, but before that, I'd like to close the webinar.
Okay.
A reminder to everyone to submit the post-evaluation survey in order to get your certificates from us. And the link will be sent to your email addresses at around 3 p.m. today, Philippine time. And if you're interested in joining the special interest group, a sign-up sheet should be available in the email you will be receiving in a while, along with the post-eval survey. You may also follow us on our social media pages of the OSSIG to get news of future events like this. The links of the Facebook and Twitter pages are in our chat box. Again, thank you everyone for participating in this webinar, and we hope that you have a good day.
I think we can have a photo opportunity.
Yes, with Gail.
Okay. Cheers, everyone.
Yes, okay.
I'll open your webcam
Yes, do.
so we can all see you from wherever you are. Hi, everyone.
Yeah.
All right.